Welcome back to all our members for our 50-second Boardroom Bites at 9 series. Today, we'll be focusing on the position of stakeholders during a time of crisis. We'll be in the very capable hands of Professor Irene-marié Esser, whose full biography will take me the whole morning to get through. She's been in Scotland since 2013, is a professor in corporate law and governance at Glasgow University, and also an extraordinary professor at Stellenbosch University. So please welcome Professor Irene-marié. Prof, can you please turn your camera on? Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that kind invitation.
I'll leave them in your capable hands, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And once again, good morning from my side. It is really lovely to be here this morning. I'm saying good morning from a sunny but windy Edinburgh, but I've heard it's quite cold in Johannesburg, so maybe you have a little bit of our weather at the moment. So thank you so much for having me this morning, and I'm really looking forward to the next half an hour to talk a little bit about the position of stakeholders during a time of crisis, and doing that specifically from a corporate law perspective. So the pandemic has brought the interests of stakeholders into more direct focus in corporate governance than was previously the case. But questions remain as to whether this represents only a temporary adjustment in response to the crisis, or alternatively, a more enduring trend. And if the latter, it prompts consideration of the appropriate techniques for stakeholder engagement and participation in corporate governance. In March 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic. The South African government declared a national disaster, resulting in various lockdowns since then. Similar to businesses across the globe, South African companies had to deal with how to manage the company's cash flow, the employees of the company, potential redundancy, remuneration issues, online meetings, the payment of dividends, and so on. These decisions will have a long-term impact on the future and operations of the company. Africa is in a unique and difficult position due to already having significant pressure on its healthcare system, otherwise occupied with HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and so on. The figures on the slide that dates to earlier this month show that this crisis is far from over, and businesses would need to continue dealing with significant pressure and challenges. So during the next 30 minutes, I will focus on the response to the pandemic from a corporate law perspective, and specifically in the context of stakeholders. In other words, those who are impacted by the activities and operations of a company, other than the shareholders, and specifically the role that the law played in this. The pandemic has prompted a wide range of responses from governments, central banks, and regulatory agencies around the world, as well as driving adaptations to corporate governance practices to cope with the new situation. As mentioned, today I will focus on stakeholder interests during board decision-making. Evident in board decision-making, a trend is observed of adaptation of practice and focus within the scope of the law to elevate the significance of stakeholder interests. For purposes of today's presentation, my focus will be on the position in South Africa. I will also make reference to the UK position for comparative purposes. In the UK, the context for that outcome is a legal regime for directors' duties, which permits a spectrum of practice linked to a rule that consideration must be given to stakeholder interests. In South Africa, it can be linked to various provisions in the Companies Act, as well as the King Report. I will therefore first discuss the underlying legal position, and that is the second bullet on your outline, regarding stakeholders, focusing specifically on, firstly, disclosure and reporting of non-financial issues. Secondly, legislative protection given to stakeholders under company law. And finally, the use of soft law mechanisms to increase stakeholder engagement. and I will then attempt to evaluate their long-term significance. I will keep this slide up for the next part of my presentation, as it really summarizes the legal position between South Africa and the UK quite well, focusing on non-financial reporting as well as statutory recognition of stakeholder interests. So globally and in South Africa, there have been ongoing debates about the position of stakeholders and to what extent their interests should be considered during board decision-making. In South Africa, the King report opted for the so-called inclusive stakeholder value approach. This implies that the board should consider the interests of all legitimate stakeholders, like employees and creditors, and not just those of the shareholders. The various interests of different stakeholders are determined on a case-by-case basis to act in the best interest of the company. A certain stakeholder may therefore receive preferential treatment if that best serves the interests of the company. Corporate social responsibility, or CSR issues, and thus also the extent of stakeholder protection, enjoy more prominence in this Companies Act than in any previous company legislation in South Africa. First, Section 7, Subsection D, confirms that one of the purposes of the Act is to reaffirm the concept of the company as a means of achieving economic and social benefit. Section 72, Subsection 4, also provides for the establishment of a Social and Ethics Committee. And Regulation 43 deals with this Social and Ethics Committee, as referred to in Section 72. So just briefly on the Social and Ethics Committee, as that is quite a vital part of corporate social responsibility and the regulation thereof under South African company law. So this regulation applies to all state-owned companies, public companies that are listed, or any other company that complies with certain criteria. So a public interest score of more than 500 points in any 2 of the preceding 5 financial years will be relevant in this regard. The public interest score is calculated at the end of the financial year as a sum of a number of things. The number of employees and the turnover are some of the factors that will therefore determine whether a company is obliged to have a Social and Ethics Committee. The public interest score is therefore a method used to determine whether a company must comply with enhanced accountability requirements based on its social and economic impact. With regards to the composition, a minimum of 3 directors or prescribed officers must serve on a company Social and Ethics Committee, and the function of this committee is to monitor the company's activities, having regard to any relevant legislation, other legal requirements, or prevailing codes of best practice. Therefore, a very broad scope. This relates to matters concerning social and economic development, including the company's position regarding the goals and purposes as envisaged in, for example, the OECD principles, as well as the Global Compact principles, as well as a record of sponsorships and consumer relationships and labor and employment. The committee should then also report annually to the shareholders at the company's annual general meeting on the matters within its mandate. Then to turn to Section 76, Subsection 3 on directors' duties. This deals with the issue in whose interest directors should manage a company, and it provides that a director of a company, when acting in that capacity, must exercise the powers and perform the functions of a director in good faith and for a proper purpose, and then importantly, in the best interest of the company. So if you look at the South African position, it is clear that stakeholders receive substantial protection in the Act. Many of the provisions are drafted in line with wider purposes than merely profit maximization, and the establishment of the Social and Ethics Committee provides stakeholders with good protection and is really a way of legislating CSR. King, although self-regulatory, is also clearly in favor of the inclusive approach. So the interests of stakeholders have to be recognized and protected, but the basic principle is still that companies have to make a profit and shareholders must receive a return on their investments. Now let's turn to the position in the UK, as it is quite interesting to compare these 2 jurisdictions. And it's also necessary if you want to make a proposal on the way forward to look at various jurisdictions. So in the UK, the duty of a director to promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, but with reference to other factors embedding some form of stakeholder protection, is codified in their Companies Act in Section 172. Even so, the UK corporate governance system is one characterized by shareholder primacy, and the shareholders are the ultimate beneficiaries of directors' duties. The consideration of non-shareholders' interests is of secondary importance and is subordinated to the interests of shareholders, confirming the supremacy of shareholders' interests. However, stakeholders have some protection through disclosure and reporting in the form of strategic reporting requirements in the Companies Act, and the latest Corporate Governance Code makes provision for various stakeholder engagement mechanisms on a comply or explain basis, for example, employee engagement mechanisms. So it is clear from this discussion that the UK and South Africa have different approaches in place to protect stakeholders and report on non-financial issues. It is, however, also clear that stakeholder inclusivity and recognition of ESG factors are important in both jurisdictions. An approach borrowing from both systems might in fact be the best approach forward, but more on this later. And I will return, explain to the diagram, or explain the diagram on the slide in a moment. The role of stakeholders has been on the corporate governance agenda for a long time. During 2019, 181 CEOs of US corporations signed a new statement on the purpose of the corporation, making 5 commitments to stakeholders. Now, whether this adds anything new is debatable, but it does show at least reflection and engagement with the topic. So when considering the role of stakeholders, the main issue is how we can ensure, through the law, that directors focus on long-term interests, act in a sustainable manner, and not merely focus on short-term goals and profit maximization. The recent pandemic puts this into perspective and brings stakeholder interests into direct focus. This crisis demonstrates which companies have truly embodied the stakeholder model and which ones have only paid lip service to it. Since March last year, we have seen companies engaging in various activities and initiatives to try to deal with the devastating impact of the virus. Some have acted contrary to the normal way, where a focus on profit making and the interests of shareholders is paramount, by focusing on the interests of other stakeholders and putting their needs above those of the shareholders. Many companies have also suspended share buybacks, scrapped dividends, and executives agreed on pay reductions. In South Africa, an analysis by Business Insider South Africa shows that at least 65 JSE-listed companies suspended dividends this year. The biggest companies that suspended their dividends include Glencore, Capitec, Investec, Rand Merchant Bank, and Sasol. So how do we respond to this from a legal perspective? What is the legal response? The motivation behind these initiatives and actions is no doubt diverse. Perhaps companies really do care, or, and this is more realistic, they realize that once this crisis submerges, they will be judged on how they dealt with it. In other words, it will have a lasting impact on their reputation. The question we need to ask, especially from a legal point of view, is whether this is the new normal. Will most companies continue to act in this way? Or will we see a move back to shareholder primacy and profit maximization once the crisis settles down? This is important as it determines how we address the stakeholder issues mentioned before for future purposes. So, in my view, there are potentially 3 responses to this question. First, the current legal position on stakeholder protection is sufficient. When it was needed in a crisis, directors did consider the interests of stakeholders. The crisis showed us that companies will step up if it is urgent and required. When it is really needed, directors will focus on the long term, on sustainability. The counter argument for this is that the actions of companies are not purely their own. they are backed by government actions. For example, the UK government self-employment income support scheme and coronavirus job retention scheme, as well as various loan schemes for businesses. And in South Africa, they also issued a direction on temporary employer relief that benefits certain categories of employees. So maybe a second response, that the law has its place, but it is really collective social action that is the driver that brought stakeholder interest into clear focus. Companies responded to that pressure as the cost for not doing this will just be too high, especially from a reputational perspective. In the end, social and market forces and collective social action played a key role. This is a valid argument, but one that will only work in the context of a crisis where urgent measures are needed. The evidence shows us that companies who followed some kind of stakeholder model before the crisis were better equipped to deal with the crisis. Companies who already have a business model in place where they consider stakeholders, where they look after their employees and consumers, for example, are in a better position to continue to do that compared to those who do not have this in place pre-crisis. Some argue that COVID served as a catalyst and demonstrates the need for good governance. What about a final or third response? Stakeholders' interests were brought to the fore during this time of a pandemic, but it is hard to imagine that it will stay this way. Companies did not change overnight, and they will potentially go back to focus on shareholder maximization and shorter-term issues. It can even be argued that it will be more so after the crisis than pre-crisis. It will be much harder to focus on the long term and be sustainable after a devastating period, financially and with potentially much less support from government. Point 3 is perhaps the most convincing response in this context. It is of utmost importance that we continue to look at the protection available to stakeholders. We should sufficiently regulate these issues nationally to be able to respond globally. So you might ask then, what is the best approach to follow? How do we deal with this? I recently proposed an entity model with my colleague at Glasgow, Professor McNeil. Our proposed entity model of ESG suggests reform in this context to promote sustainability in the corporate sector more effectively, focusing on disclosure, but also on stakeholder committees, a link with remuneration, voluntary say-on-purpose provisions, and mandatory due diligence. Our emphasis is on the corporate track. In other words, ESG issues or environmental, social, and governance issues should be considered during board decision-making rather than through the investment track, where ESG issues have been more to the fore, but where the focus is still aligned with shareholder primacy, risk and return. And there is potentially less scope for stakeholder engagement and inclusion. So for the next part of my presentation, I will try to explain this model that you will see on the slide now, being termed the entity model, which is a hybrid model relying on hard law, soft law, and voluntary action, focusing on process on the one hand and substance on the other hand. So let's deal a little bit more with this and this suggested proposal. First, I can refer to an empirical study that I conducted with co-authors in the UK based on a period of 2 years and the annual reports of the FTSE 100 companies. And this study demonstrated that UK companies do comply with mandatory and even comply or explain non-financial reporting requirements, but that disclosure of non-financial information is not enough, with the result that stakeholder engagement and participation methods are needed. In other words, statutory compliance with disclosure requirements does not necessarily result in quality reporting. It was clear from the interviews that we had with various stakeholders like NGOs, trade unions, and so on, that they want to have more input on the type of disclosed information and the format of the report. The board should interact with all stakeholder groups and disclose steps taken to consider their interests into the decision-making processes, as the reports are generally too descriptive and rarely contain evidence on how stakeholders were actually involved in decision-making. Based on this, several suggestions can be made on the way forward. So this deals now with statutory non-financial reporting requirements, as you will see on the slide under the process heading. So I've mentioned before the UK strategic report, and that is definitely a step in the right direction being provided for in the Companies Act. The strategic report in the UK is similar to integrated reporting followed in South Africa, but it is statutory and not merely self-regulatory or voluntary. By legislating non-financial disclosure, it will be easier for companies to ensure that they do indeed report on all relevant ESG issues, and stakeholders will be able to use the reports to be informed, but also more engaged. For this to succeed, the relationship between financial and non-financial information should be clear. The accessibility of the disclosed information easy, the volume of information being disclosed regulated, and a framework should be followed where the information is disclosed in a clear, holistic, and similar manner. Quality disclosure is unlikely to be achieved unless companies understand that ESG matters may have not only clear and positive reputational impacts, but also impact on a company's bottom line and may provide business benefits and competitive advantages over peers, even if they are not immediately clear, certain, or measurable. Often the main reasons for disclosing non-financial information are purely compliance, whilst the genuine interest in ESG matters is unfortunately at the bottom of the list. So then let's move then to the position of stakeholders. In other words, how their interests should be considered by directors and how to get them more engaged. So not just to inform them by way of reporting, but to get them actually engaged through participation in decision-making processes. A process-driven approach might be the best approach forward. There is no mechanism for market discipline available to stakeholders similar to the selling option available to shareholders. And therefore the rationale for comply or explain, in other words, that you need to comply, and if you do not comply, you need to explain your reasons, is weaker in this context. A mandatory committee considering ESG issues will provide a level playing field for stakeholder engagement. And the South African Social and Ethics Committee is in principle a good initiative to give effect to the interests of stakeholders. So that is also under the process part of the slide, Stakeholder Board Committee. The role of directors is to develop and implement a sustainable business model for the company that provides a competitive return to shareholders. When doing this, they need to have regard to the interests of various stakeholders. By having a committee that addresses the board on issues that are relevant when making business decisions, directors should be in a better position to make the best decision for the company. However, there are various shortcomings and uncertainties with this type of committee. Its terms of reference are not clear and it's quite broad. There is uncertainty as to whether this is a board committee or a company committee, and this has various implications. The tension that can be created between the board and the shareholders is also problematic on the fact that committees should report back to the shareholders. Despite this, the aims and functions of the Social and Ethics Committee should at least sensitize the board in respect of the interest and importance of other stakeholders. Another good way to deal with this is through engagement mechanisms, similar to provision 5 in the UK Corporate Governance Code. This operates on a comply or explain basis, and it takes the stakeholder agenda a step forward by requiring listed companies to adopt one of 3 potential options for workforce engagement. It moves beyond disclosure to regulate process, indicating a shift to a more explicit process for the integration of stakeholder interests. So to conclude on this, disclosure plays a crucial role, but on its own, it is not enough to improve stakeholder participation and engagement. For stakeholders to be fully engaged, they need adequate information in the form of disclosure, but they also need mechanisms to facilitate participation from their side. Combining an advisory stakeholder panel and a designated non-executive director representing all stakeholders is a workable option. The South African Social and Ethics Committee can be used as an example in this context. In South Africa, a recent study on this committee revealed that most companies that took part in the study admit that their social and ethics committees are in the early stages of development, and they expect their mandates to be refined, to develop a deeper understanding of the issues and their strategic importance, and to have the composition adjusted with a greater focus on independence. Respondents also expressed interest in strengthening their management systems with improved performance dashboards and data quality. There are factors to keep in mind when considering a similar structure. However, the committee is uniquely placed with direct access to the main board and a mandate to reach into the depths of the business. As a result, it is capable of having a strong influence on the way a company heads down the path of sustained value creation. Further, in this context, a duty of due diligence would give more prominence to the role of board decision-making in ensuring sustainable outcomes, and a stakeholder board committee might well play a role here to fulfill an oversight function or even be required to sign off on the due diligence. Challenges, however, remain regarding setting a basis for liability and enforcement of such a duty, especially if it is to be framed to encompass standards as well as procedural dimension. Over time, the use of metrics and targets might help to provide a basis for liability for breach of standards. But even so, private enforcement, for example, through derivative action, would likely remain problematic, and so an element of public enforcement would be worth considering. But for the immediate future, we, as per this suggested model, would favor a model that adopts a procedural approach linked to reporting. We see the key element of due diligence as being the integration of stakeholder interests and perspectives in board decision-making. Our model would thus not make substantive adjustments to directors' duties, nor change the pattern of enforcement to provide legal remedies to stakeholders against directors. Other ways, part of a hybrid model to address stakeholder concerns, include the potential to integrate ESG more effectively with remuneration and incentives and voluntary say-on-purpose provisions. But we can perhaps talk about that a little bit more during the Q&A. So formal legal change has not featured prominently in the response to the pandemic, albeit that some interventions, such as mortgage holidays in the UK, for example, have de facto adjusted pre-existing legal rights and duties. In the case of stakeholder interests, the flexible nature of the legal standard represented by directors' duties, like sections 172 in the UK, for example, facilitated an elevation in the significance of stakeholders' interests in response to social pressure. Nevertheless, I conclude that without more effective progress on an effective mechanism to integrate stakeholder interests into board decision-making, the pandemic response is unlikely to have lasting impact. I thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to discuss this during the next half an hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that very stimulating presentation. We'll be going on to the Q&A, and if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask their questions live, that would also help. I think we just have one question while we're just waiting for more to come through. Is the Social and Ethics Committee not sufficient to cover stakeholder relations instead of another board subcommittee as per your model? That's from Jeremy.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think we are not proposing another subcommittee necessarily under our model. We are just proposing some form of a board committee or some form of a committee to deal with stakeholder interests. I've just used the Social and Ethics Committee as an example because South Africa is one of the few jurisdictions that has such a committee in place that is actually mandatory for certain companies to have. So the Social and Ethics Committee is a very good starting point for other jurisdictions that's interested in following a similar approach, you know, to look at that committee as an example. But if you go back to our model, the idea is really just to mention that one way to deal with stakeholder engagement is to have some form of committee in place under the process requirements of the model.
Okay. So, Prof, another question is disclosure a reliable mechanism to promote stakeholder interests and ultimately get them more engaged and involved in decision making? Are there alternative approaches that you would favor?
Yes, thank you. That is a good question. And I think perhaps the starting point with this question is, yes, disclosure is indeed a good mechanism to protect stakeholder interests, mainly by keeping them informed. But when we did our study on disclosure, trying to look at how, well, firstly, whether companies comply, and secondly, how stakeholders, view this, how do they experience this, we found that companies do indeed comply. They disclose a lot. They are almost over complying in a sense. But the view from the stakeholders that we interviewed was that they are finding it sometimes hard to follow. It's too much information. There's no holistic approach to it. So there's various problems with disclosure, but I don't think we should move, away from disclosure. It's still very important. What is perhaps more important is to view the protection given to stakeholders as a set of mechanisms or tools. So not just to try to focus on, say, changing directors' duties, or just focus on disclosure, or just focus on board committees, but rather, and that is what we are trying to suggest in our model, take from various, or try to use various mechanisms to deal with it. So yes, disclosure is a good mechanism, but I think you need to add to that by, for example, having some form of engagement mechanism like in the UK, or some form of a committee like in South Africa. And as I tried to explain earlier, due diligence also plays a really important role in this regard.
Thank you. So Mulatilo is asking, are the reporting requirements the same for non-profit organizations?
Yes, so while in the UK, the strategic reporting requirements are only for a certain set of companies and profit-making companies, in South Africa, you do not have that reporting requirements in the Companies Act being mandatory through the Companies Act. So it's not required under the Companies Act, but you do have integrated reporting recommended through the King report, which is of course self-regulatory, but then it is once again required for listed companies. So it is different for non-profit organizations.
Okay, thanks. Another very good question asks, recently in Esser, there have been talks about forced employee representation on boards. What is your view of this? And does it not make one stakeholder more important than the others?
Yes, that is a very good question, and I am actually very interested in that, because it's been in the media quite a lot recently, saying that they would like to have some form of employee representation on boards. Now, of course, that is something that we do not have in South Africa at the moment, and also you do not have that in the UK, for example. It's something that you have in a country like Germany, where you have a two-tier board structure, where it works quite differently from the board structure perspective compared to the unitary structure in South Africa. So I would say my initial view is that I am not in favor of having employee representation on boards, mainly because of the point that you are making, that it does put one stakeholder above another. And I think you can deal with employees' rights and get them represented and get stakeholders generally engaged through other mechanisms and tools rather than a seat on the board.
Excellent. Charles got his hand up. I'll just allow Charles to talk, and then he can ask his question live. Hi, Charles.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Professor Esser, for a great presentation. My question regards your last comment around other mechanisms of engaging stakeholders. So yeah, just to ask you maybe to speak about the options for other mechanisms to get inputs from stakeholders. So an example of one that I'm a fan of is conducting ethics risk opportunity assessments, where from your employees, your suppliers or regulators, you get a mechanism where they can sort of give you a perception of the organization, and that can give a structured sort of feedback and reports to the board and inform actions going forward. So maybe if you could just talk around, what some of those mechanisms could be. I know you spoke about integrated reporting as well earlier, but maybe, if you could just, speak a little bit more on that aspect.
Yes.
Of how practical organization can engage stakeholders.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Yes, so I think perhaps a starting point is the entity model that I referred to earlier, because with that model, we are trying to look at various mechanisms to ensure greater stakeholder engagement. So not just to protect them through information and keep them informed, that is of course important as well, and that is where disclosure and reporting comes in, but really to look at other ways to get them engaged in the decision making, and that is similar to the outcome that you would have if you actually sit on a board. So what we are thinking of there is to focus more on process rather than substance. So firstly, we are not proposing to change directors' duties to include stakeholders, as a beneficiary under their duties specifically, and linking that to remedies. We are also not proposing, like some other people are proposing, a sort of a sustainability obligation or even a due diligence obligation that falls under your duties. What we are rather focusing on is reporting and then linking that to various procedural mechanisms, for instance, board committees or stakeholder engagement mechanisms. Now, some of these mechanisms may include an advisory stakeholder panel. It may be a non-executive director that sits on the board that's there just for stakeholders and to look into their views. And another possibility is that there's also a due diligence obligation that you can then maybe even link to a board committee, like say the Social and Ethics Committee, to sign off on this due diligence. And also later on, you can maybe even make use of metrics in this context as a way to ensure proper due diligence. So still very much focused on the process side of things, but going beyond mere reporting. And perhaps something to also say in this regard that is, I think, quite important, and that our model is really built on, is also to focus on the corporate track. So when I say that is to focus and to try to deal with CSR and ESG issues through board decision making, rather than trying to deal with it through the investment track where ESG really currently sits. So through investment decisions, because with the investment track, the ultimate aim is still risk and return. But if you go through the corporate track, you have better scope and more potential to actually protect stakeholders. Thanks. I hope that answers your question.
Okay,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles. Moving on to Parker's also got his hand raised. Okay, online.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. I would like to know your view of the US the reforms, where they also talk about long term. Do you think that will influence US now investing much on stakeholder capitalism? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, so with regards to the position in the US, today's presentation, I did not focus on the US specifically, but of course it is a very important jurisdiction to consider. And since the election, you will see quite a bit in the press on their recognition of ESG issues and the fact that they want to bring that definitely more to the fore, but specifically within the investment track, as I mentioned before. So yes, thanks for that question.
Okay.
So, Jeremy says, should there not be more detailed ESG reporting in the integrated report to give more meaning to stakeholder issues, challenges, etc.?
Yes, so with the integrated report, you are obviously supposed to report on your non-financial information. So you should ideally report on how you've considered environmental, social, and governance issues. With a strategic report, for instance, in the UK, they actually tell you exactly what you need to report on. And they also say certain issues like, say, gender diversity is mandatory to report on that. Other issues, it is on a comply or explain basis. It also depends on the type of company. And so that is the strategic reporting requirements that's similar to an integrated report. In the UK, they've gone further, and they also now require a Section 172 statement from certain companies, where you have to actually report on how you complied with Section 172. And if you can recall, Section 172 states that directors need to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the company, but with reference to various factors. So they actually do list various stakeholders in Section 172. So you need to report on that. To come back to the South African position, you also, of course, need to report on how you've followed the King report, and certain parts of that is mandatory if you're a listed company. But if you just report on King on a apply and explain basis, as is the basis that you need to report for King, then you will have to report on how you've considered the issues of stakeholders, as King really recommends or requires an inclusive approach. So we look at stakeholders on a case-to-case basis.
Thank you. Pamela, I think has a great question here. May we assume that the same principles of ESG are equally important for non-profit companies? For example, the homeowners associations of community schemes.
Yes, so I think that is a very interesting question, and maybe a good starting point is, if you want to answer that specifically from a South African perspective, is also to look at the King report in this regard, because this King report applies to all organizations, which is different from previous King reports. And they actually, they make various recommendations with regards to stakeholders, for instance, and ESG, well, they refer to it as stakeholders, of course, in King. And they do make certain sort of different ways in which you can deal with various things depending on the type of organization that you are dealing with. And King also has sector supplements that you can have a look at for medical aids, for instance, and so on. So it is indeed very interesting to look at. But in general, the principle is the same of stakeholder inclusivity. But obviously, you cannot follow exactly the same principles for all types of organizations.
Thank you. Anda's got a very heavy one here. While the ESG entity model talks about process and substance, how effective is this model to deal with practical issues related to the tensions between labor and employer, communities and companies, and also company operations and products versus environmental compliance and protection?
Yes, that is indeed a loaded question, and perhaps one that I can't give you a definite answer to. But I think maybe the starting point is to say that we should at least try to address employee concerns, try to ensure that employees are engaged in business decision making. And perhaps provision 5 in the UK Corporate Governance Code can be used as an example here. That is a very new provision where they now require companies on a comply or explain basis to make use of some form of workforce engagement mechanism. So they are not focusing in that provision on stakeholders generally. They are focusing really on the workforce, and not just employees, the workforce generally. And then you need to opt for one of these options. And we started to do some empirical research on that, and we did find that companies are following those options. But with how successful it is, it's perhaps too early to tell at this point whether it actually helps. But my point is still that is definitely better. It's better to have that than to have nothing, just because it is a difficult problem to solve. And once again, to look at that mechanism of, say, employee engagement or these type of mechanisms, but look at that as only one mechanism in a set of mechanisms.
Thank you. So John is asking if there is a danger that stakeholders get more influence on shareholders who can only appoint or remove directors. What's your opinion on that?
Yes, so I think maybe to start with this question is to keep the general company law structure, in the UK, in South Africa, in most countries, in mind here, and that it was built on one with shareholder primacy. It comes from the point of view where directors are the agents. They need to act in the best interest of the shareholders, and the shareholders have various rights and they can vote, they appoint the directors, they remove the directors. So any type of suggestion or model that you are making with regards to trying to protect stakeholders, you still need to keep general company law in mind when you do that. And that is, you can't just change that. If you want to give stakeholders direct rights, you say that the company has to do what is best for the stakeholders. You almost follow a pluralist type of approach. In other words, you say, all of the stakeholders are equal footing, directors need to act in their best interest, and you also provide them with remedies, then that is very difficult, almost impossible to do within the current company law structure. And that is why we are trying to make suggestions, trying to protect stakeholders, but keeping that in mind.
Thank you. Question from Alison. You said that the UK is more inclined and balanced to support shareholder interests than shareholders. Okay, hold on. Support shareholders' interests. What are the key elements to indicate that this is the case?
So that they are supporting stakeholders more than shareholders?
Yes, then to support shareholders' interests more than. Okay, I think let's park that one there for a second. Okay, let's go to Mkhuleli. How do you view the entity model influencing the enterprise and supply development programs from the board's perspective, if adopted?
Sorry, how do I view the entity model?
How does the prof see the entity model influencing the enterprise and supply development programs from the board's perspective, if that is adopted?
Well, I haven't really looked into how this model will influence that. I think the aim of this model is trying to get all stakeholders on some form of protection and participation in decision making. There's a lot of focus usually on employees, and they are often sort of given, other than the shareholders, given more protection than other stakeholders. But I think our model is really, it is supposed to apply to all stakeholders, and so for supply and demand, consumers, customers, so not just focusing on employees, but all stakeholders.
Question from...
Sorry, maybe just to add there that we are obviously proposing this model as a way to deal with stakeholder engagement and participation, but we need to keep in mind that there is also, company law is not the only place where we deal with this. There's a lot of other legislation in place protecting stakeholders. So you have your insolvency legislation for creditors, consumer protection for consumers, labor relations for labor law. So we shouldn't forget about the other protection that's already available as well. But our focus is very much how to get them involved in decision-making on board level. So not just protection.
A question from Jennifer Jeffter. What are the ESG metrics one would consider including in performance agreements for ESG managers?
Yes, so there's a various sets of metrics of ESG globally. So usually companies will use a similar set of metrics. They will decide which set to use, and that is the metrics that they opt for. So and there's not one single set to use. There's various metrics that you can use as long as it is measurable and you indicate which one you are using. So that would be the best approach.
Christian is asking that across the world, employees are not really recognized as a stakeholder. And in some areas, their potential to contribute to corporate value is underestimated. How do we change this behavior?
Well, I'm not sure whether I agree that employees are not recognized as stakeholders. I think they definitely fall under the definition of a stakeholder. And globally, when companies or countries are trying to address stakeholder concerns, they usually start by focusing on the employees, other than the shareholders. So a stakeholder is really anyone who has a stake in the business. So you can define it quite broadly as primary stakeholders, secondary stakeholders. I mean, there's different ways in which you can define it, but employees definitely do qualify as stakeholders.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just checking what we have on time. I think we'll just take one last question. Tembiso's got her hand up. Let me just, Ash Tembiso, you're online if you want to ask your question.
Yes. I just wanted to check her view, the prof's view, sorry, on the Burger King deal, and how are they? What is the view when you look at the measure which seeks to reduce the BE shareholding in the company, which is a major stakeholder, especially in the South African context?
Thank you.
Yes, so I don't think I will go into detail with that. That is quite complex for a large question, but perhaps just to mention that obviously the relevant legislation with regards to BEE will be applicable in that instance, and also the relevant legislation regarding takeovers and mergers and acquisitions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I think we'll call it a day with regards to that. The rest of the questions, we'll send them to the prof for review, and thereafter send an email to all the attendees with all the answered questions. That works great. Okay.
So perhaps, sorry, if anyone has a question they really need an answer to, they're welcome to email me the question and I can respond to that in that way. That might be easier if that is okay with you. Then they welcome. My email address is on the last slide. If they want to email any last questions to me, I'm more than happy to answer that.
Yeah, I think we still have time for 2 more questions, Prof.
Okay.
Yeah, I may not have read the time properly. So we have a question from Alison.
So that question of Alison, maybe she can just confirm, I think one of the words shareholder should read stakeholder. So are you saying that it supports stakeholder interest or shareholder interest?
Shareholder interest.
Yes, so the position in the UK is that even though in section 172 that deals with the promotion of the success of the company, reference is made to other factors like other stakeholders are listed in section 172. It is still very much based on what is called the enlightened shareholder value approach. In other words, shareholder primacy. Even though you consider these other interests, in the end, your decision should still be what is best for the shareholders. So it's within the subjective discretion of the directors to what an extent they consider these other factors. And those stakeholders do not have direct remedies because of section 172. But a move sort of more towards stakeholders, on the other hand, is perhaps the strategic reporting requirements, as well as some of the new requirements or recommendations in the corporate governance code, like provision 5, making provision on a comply or explain basis for employee engagement mechanisms.
Okay. A nice question from Clive. Clive says, I have found that the public interest score is often interpreted narrowly to negate the need for an SEC when not mandatory according to the Companies Act. My understanding is that we need to consider all the beneficial interests, which could increase the score significantly. What's your view on this?
Yes, and that is a good question. And I think some of the studies show that a lot of companies do not have social and ethics committees in place yet. Obviously, if you do go over that score, it is mandatory. And it's also recommended in King that even if your public interest score is lower than 500, even if you are not one of the companies that's required to have a social and ethics committee, it is still recommended that you have such a committee or something similar in place. So whether you need to change the score, I'm not sure whether that will really solve the problem. It goes to more than just box ticking with regards to that. It's really to get this sort of idea out there that it's actually good to have this committee, and it's not something to be afraid of, and it's something that should potentially actually help you. But yes, that is a very interesting question.
Okay. From Andrew, what I'm hearing is you advocating a practical approach of boards adding to their checklist on decision-making, an analysis of the decision as to whether it passes muster on all ESG consideration before the decision is actioned. Whether this is done in the board meeting or a separate S&E committee meeting will depend on the size and structure of the board. Furthermore, the board must provide mechanisms for stakeholders to engage the company or board if they feel that the ESG considerations have not been sufficiently addressed in a decision. Is this a fair summary of your view?
Well, it is a summary of some of what I said. Perhaps, hopefully, the approach does not add to a checklist. I think we are really trying to move away from any form of box ticking. So really trying to not just have procedures in place ticking those boxes, but really have substance to that. So really, in brief, what I was trying to say with our proposed view is that it's a hybrid model where you look at soft law as well as hard law mechanisms, as well as voluntary mechanisms, and from a procedural perspective, focusing on reporting and disclosure. Now that is in place already, but try to get that more standardized, make sure that it is quality reporting, and then link that to some form of stakeholder engagement mechanism, be that a non-executive director, advisory panel member, or a board committee. And then the third suggestion on the process side was the due diligence obligation. We haven't really spoken a lot about this, but other ways to deal with this potentially, and that has been happening a lot in the last year or so, is to link ESG criteria with remuneration. So that is another potential way to deal with that. That is still in the early stages, and the research on that is just starting to come out quite a bit. And then finally, another voluntary way that can be added to that is to have say on purpose provision. So shareholders can vote on that to say in the articles of the company, do they want it to state that one of the purposes of the company is to be more sustainable, for instance. So to have that say on purpose, but on a voluntary opt-in basis.
Okay. Kulili has an interesting one. Must they focus on ESG for enterprise development or prioritize their BE value alone?
So what do you mean, must they, the board, focus on ESG for enterprise development?
Yes.
So the board obviously has to consider everything that is relevant when making business decisions. So they need to look at hard law, legislation in place, as well as soft law, the King report recommendations, but BE legislation, of course, they need to consider that as well, as it is legislation.
Okay. I think one last question. I'm not sure if you're any comment or your take on the Clover issue reported yesterday, given their stakeholder model.
So I've seen the closure of Clover issue actually only this morning, but I haven't had a chance to look into that in detail. So yes, no comment yet.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. It was really nice having you on board and for taking your time all the way from Edinburgh.
Of course, no, it's really very nice to be here and to be able to engage with the topic that I feel passionate about. So thank you so much for the invitation. And perhaps I can just put the next slide up. There is some links on the slide to some additional material. My LinkedIn and email address is on the slide, as well as on the next slide there, I think there's some sources or links to articles. If anyone is interested in anything to read more about that, they will be able to find it there.
All right. We'll be sending the presentation and the video to all attendees, so they'll be able to catch up.
All right.
Then. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a good day. Thanks for everyone attending.
Before everyone leaves, the IRDSA, this will be, we won't be having any BB at 9 programs the last 2 weeks of June. We have something cooking in the shop that will be presenting our members So please watch this space. Thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you so much. Thank you.